Hi, in this video I'm going to do a review on this book which is entitled From Creation to Unification, written by Stuart Anslow. It's the complete histories behind the Ch'ang Hon ITF patterns. This book was given to me by my student Farouk, who now lives in California, and he bought it for me while I was over there recently. So thanks for the generous gift. If you're an ITF practitioner like me, you're probably aware that there are 24 patterns developed by General Choi, the father and founder of Taekwon-Do. And each of the patterns is named after an important person or an important date in Korean history, or a philosophical idea which is relating to Korean culture. Now, there are 12 principles behind the patterns which are described in the Taekwondo Encyclopedia. And principle number 12 states that each movement in the pattern must express the personality and spiritual character of the person it's named after. So the Taekwondo Encyclopedia has a description of what each pattern is named after. But the descriptions are very brief, a couple of sentences or a paragraph at the most. So how are we supposed to understand the spiritual character of a person with such little information about them? Because most of us weren't taught Korean history at school unless you lived in Korea. Perhaps General Choi wanted us to do further research, but many students are not very academic, and even if they are, to do the research is quite time consuming. But fortunately, people have written essays and books on the subject, and this is one such book. The book starts off with a chapter entitled Kings, Kingdoms, Emperors and Dynasties, which explains the definition of these terms, which are mentioned throughout the book. And then it follows up with another chapter entitled Romanization of Korean. And this is useful because it explains why you often find different spellings for the names of the historical people and the dynasties. Before moving on to the description of the definition of each of the patterns, the author writes a chapter on the brief history of Korea, starting from the legendary tale of Dangun, the founder of Korea in the year 2333 BC, and up to the more recent history of the last century. And it's useful because it gives you a foundation of how the dynasties evolved over time and how China and Japan were involved in Korean history either as allies or as enemies. And it helps to get all the historical people into some chronological context. And a nice touch by the author, he's got these boxes called Putting It Into Context, where he describes what was going on in Western history at that time. Because while you're reading about Korean history, it's quite easy to forget what was going on in the rest of the world. So that helps to put it into context. So that was a really nice touch. The following chapters are on each of the patterns, starting with Chonji, obviously. And the first paragraph on each of these chapters is the description of the pattern as written in the Taekwondo Encyclopedia. As I said before, these are very brief. And the next paragraph is useful because it describes how many movements in the pattern, which grades practice that pattern. But what I found very useful, it also gives you an indication of when the pattern was developed, what year, and which masters helped General Choi to develop the pattern. So that's very useful information which was not written in the Taekwondo Encyclopedia. And that was quite revealing because you'd have thought Chonji would have been one of the first patterns developed, but actually it was Farang, the very first one. I don't want to give too many spoilers, you'll need to read the book, but it's quite useful, this paragraph, because it explains which patterns came first. I found the book very easy to read, never getting bored of it. The author did a very good job of mainly writing about the interesting or the relevant parts of the Korean history. And this helped to get a better understanding of the character of each of the historical people it's writing about. And as you read through the book, you get a much better understanding about the characteristic and the nature of the Korean people. Throughout the book, the author points out several factual inaccuracies as written in the Taekwondo Encyclopedia. For example, Do-san, Ang Chang-ho, his lifespan is quoted as being 1876 to 1938, when in fact his date of birth was 1878. So this came as a shock to me. I didn't realize there were so many factual inaccuracies. So I do what most instructors do, is just I give the literature to my students based on what's written in the encyclopedia. And all this time I've been asking my students at gradings to explain what Dosan's named after, and of course they quote what's written in the encyclopedia, and I didn't know any better. I've been nodding my head in approval, but now I know better. I think what I'll do, I'll still nod my head in approval, but I think I'll shock them by saying wrong at the end. So something needs to be done about these inaccuracies, but it's useful to read the book to find out what these inaccuracies are. As I read through the book, I couldn't help but be impressed by the amazing characters of Korean history. No wonder General Choi picked these people to represent the patterns. And the author did a great job to bring out the spiritual character of each of these people. You start to understand the patriotism of Ch'ang Hon and An Jung-geun, the bravery of warriors such as Yushin, the strategic genius of people like Admiral Yi Sun-sin and Ulji, and the amazing things that some kings did. For example, Sejong, who invented the Korean alphabet and simplified it so that the common people could learn it. And this helped me to get some insight on why the pattern is done in the way it is. For example, pattern Sejong, even though it's taught to a 5th degree level, it's quite a simple pattern. And when you understand what Sejong did, simplify the alphabet for the common people, you understand why Sejong is quite a simple pattern. And for example, Ulji, Ulji used hit and run tactics. So the pattern, you'll notice, it has a lot of movements where you attack and then suddenly retreat. And when you read the way that Ulji fought, you'll start to understand why the pattern is done in that way. So the book really gives you some great insight into the patterns. In the Taekwondo encyclopedia, some of the descriptions of the patterns don't explain why there is a certain number of movements in the pattern. For example, Chungmu, it's 30 movements, but it doesn't explain why. But this book has some suggestions for some of the patterns why there is a certain number of movements. For example, Chungmu, the 30 movements could represent the 30 ships that Admiral Yi Sun-sin destroyed out of a fleet of 333 when you only had 13 ships. So this seems quite reasonable. And in fact, I wish I knew that much earlier, because I remember once I was doing a grading and I was part of a panel of 3. There was my sister as an examiner, Esther Narditzi, and Peter Harkis, now Grandmaster Harkis, sat in the middle, and I was one of the examiners. And there was this student who was really good at the theory. He was going for 1st degree, he was a 1st cup, and all the questions that my sister asked, he answered correctly, and the same with Peter Harkis. And then I asked him questions, again, 100% correct. I finally asked him, what does Chungmu, what is it named after? And he gave the answer correct. So at this point, he was standing very proud, knowing he was doing so well, and quite rightly so. So I said, one final question. What do the 30 movements represent? And suddenly, he paused. His mind was blank. Just dropped his head, shook his head, and said, "Sorry, sir, I don't know." And I said, "You may dismiss." So he turned round, walked away, still shaking his head. He was obviously disappointed. I mean, he did great. He answered nearly everything right, but he couldn't answer that question. So the other 2 examiners turned around and said, "What do the 30 movements represent?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I thought he might. He's so smart." They burst out laughing. So probably if I was grading Stuart Anslow, he would have probably given me a really good answer. I would have been well impressed. The book not only covers the 24 current ITF patterns, but it also mentions Kodangtul, which is the old pattern that got replaced by Juchetul. And towards the end of the book, there's an appendix on the GTF patterns, which is the organization set up by Master Park Chun-tae, and he made up a number of extra patterns for that federation. There's another appendix as well at the end called Revising the Definitions, where the author has taken the explanations from the encyclopedia and amended it. So he's corrected all the factual inaccuracies. He's also suggested some additional text to go into the explanation to just clarify some of the histories, and also made suggestions for reasons why certain patterns end up with a certain number of movements. Okay, so overall, it's a really good read. If you're a very keen Taekwondo practitioner, I do recommend it. Now, this video is not sponsored at all. I'm not getting any commission for plugging it. I genuinely was interested to read it, and I genuinely recommending this book. So I will be recommending it to my students. They can't have my copy because I know what happens if I lend it out. I never get it back. So I need to read this book over and over again because you can't assimilate all the information. There's so much information there that, it takes quite a few reads for all of it to sink in. But thoroughly recommend it. I think it's available on Amazon. So that's the book, From Creation to Unification by Stuart Anslow. Thanks for watching.